Remember this? Go placidly amid the noise and haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. Therefore, be at peace with God, whatever you conceive that to be, and whatever your labors and aspirations in the noisy confusion of life, keep peace with your soul. Some of us have heard this, the desiderata, so many times it feels stilted, but in the late 1960s it felt like the proverbial balm of Gilead, like we could take a deep breath and exhale. It was certainly calming in a time of tremendous tension and strife. We wanted to believe the attribution that it was found at Old St. Paul's Church, Baltimore, AD 1692, but anyone who'd read an original document from even the 19th century, like the Gettysburg Address, knew that the desiderata couldn't be something from the 17th century. In fact, writer and poet Max Ehrmann, a Hoosier, composed it in the early 20th century. The line, "You are a child of the universe, you have a right to be here," was especially meaningful to those of us in the 60s who were sensing that human beings were being disrespectful of Mother Earth, and that maybe the human race is a plague, in much the same way that climate change crisis has us again asking our species' capability for long-term success. Back then, in extreme cases, it could become a kind of self-hatred, and there's some of that still around. Max Ehrmann's prose poem resonated with those of us who thought a purposeful rebalancing of humanity and nature was a better way. For me, on a feeling level, it captures the spirit of gentle, loving, sensible universalism. The idea of hell is ancient and varied. Some traditions have it as a cold place. A strong revival of the fear of hellfire came in the time of Jonathan Edwards and his Great Awakenings. These revivals were in large part a reaction to the Enlightenment's making old-time religion less relevant and less powerful. For centuries, authorities had used the idea of heaven and hell to control the behavior of the common people. Do your job, stay out of trouble, act with Christian charity, and you might get into heaven. Sin with any sort of regularity, and you will be punished in this life and the next. Some of us here may have been raised in faiths that taught this doctrine. Some of you may, as children, have had daydreams or nightmares about yourself being literally damned to hell. Well, you do know you've sinned, don't you? And when you sin, you have to be punished, don't you? That makes sense, doesn't it? Seriously, my mother was raised Methodist in the 1920s and was never able to fully rid her psyche of a sense of inherent guilt and shame. Catholics talk a lot about guilt and shame a lot, too. My friend and colleague, the late Jeremy Taylor, the accomplished dream worker and Unitarian minister, describes Universalism like this. In contrast to the Unitarian heresy, God is one, not three, which is a phenomenon of the West, Universalism is a global heresy. There are heretic Christian Universalist, heretic Muslim Universalist, heretic Hindu Universalist, and heretic native shaman Universalist. It appears in all religious traditions, which more or less agree that if you are considering the divine in its entirety, it is impossible to imagine, in good conscience, anything that does not have its origin in the divine, and anything worthy of the noble name of God must, by definition, be the source and support of all. And so say the Universalists in their varied accents and traditions, since it's impossible to imagine anything that which does not come from God in the beginning is equally impossible to imagine anything that does not return to God in the end. Therefore, all are saved. When preparing for this talk, I ran across a website entitled, "God is Not a Sadist." Expanding on that simple, memorable expression, a Christian Universalist friend of mine points out that if we believe in and worship a God that treats people with unspeakable cruelty, might we feel we have permission to treat people cruelly ourselves? When I found inside What I found inside that God is Not a Sadist website was the homepage of the Universalist Christians Association, not associated with the Unitarian Universalist Association. Like Unitarianism, Universalism has its roots in Greek philosophy and in the early Christian church. For the first 300 years of the Christian era, universal salvation was accepted by everyone, for did not the Apostle Paul write in his letter to the Romans, "Therefore, as by the offense of one, Adam, judgment came upon all men to condemnation, even so, by the righteousness of one, Jesus, the free gift came upon all men unto justification of life." That is to say, all are saved. With the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire, the politicians got involved, and soon universalism was condemned again as a heresy. The authorities took back the power of the carrot of heaven and the stick of hell. It survived in an underground existence until the wraps were taken off during the initial openness of the Reformation. But soon it was condemned again by both the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant leaders. Knowing the ways of the world as we do, we are not surprised, are we? It went underground again, emerging 200 years later in the safety of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Unitarianism began in Poland and Central Europe and England before being transported to the American colonies. But Universalism, as we know it, began in America. Although English Presbyterian and dissenting preachers had inspired some of its pioneers, the first Universalist church built anywhere in the world was erected in Massachusetts, and for 150 years Universalism spread across the United States. But by the 1870s, Universalism had entered its slow decline. The main reason is that the more liberal Protestant churches began to tamp down the hellfire and shift focus. One by one, they began adopting some variation of the idea of universal reconciliation. Another factor was Universalism's weakness of structure. The Universalist faith had never attracted the rich. It was always just getting by, and although its resolute stand in favor of democracy and freedom accomplished much to separate church and state, it was so resistant to authority of any kind that it never developed a strong organization. At a retrospective of the 1960s that I attended years ago, someone asked one of the panelists, Abby Hoffman, if the Beatles were right that all you need is love. And Abby said, "Sure, all you need is love and organization. Well-organized love is what most of the do-gooder groups we're associated with are trying to do." Throughout the 19th century, despite many similarities and shared interests, the Universalists and the Unitarians kept their distance from each other. It was said that the Universalists thought the Unitarians were insufficiently Christian, and the Unitarians thought the Universalists made light of sin. James Freeman Clarke had proclaimed the 5 points of the Unitarian faith that people found easy to remember. Number 1, the fatherhood of God, then the brotherhood of man, then the leadership of Jesus, salvation by character, and the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. As you see, the Unitarians believed in salvation by character. Universalists believed in salvation irrespective of character. There were also differences in class feeling. The Unitarians were disliked for being associated with high-mindedness and heaps of old money and the superior air of the Boston Brahmins. The Universalists were looked down on for being raggedy, middle class at best, and anti-establishment. After a long courtship with the Congregationalists, the Universalists negotiated a merger with the Unitarians. Yes, we were their second choice. The merger became effective in 1961, and Universalism was never heard from again. Or so we thought. Although we don't hear much about Universalism per se anymore, it, like a river that is drawn from many tributaries, has branched out and reunited, braiding with Christian charity and rational religion, diving underground repeatedly only to burst forth again unexpectedly in our time, helping to power the new Unitarian Universalist spirituality, an impulse which many believe holds promise for the growth and general strengthening of liberal religion in America. There is a universal longing to be connected to the source of all. We may remember St. Augustine's intuitive cry to his God, "Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee." He's saying we love God and wish to live in the divine embrace. This is expressed in a very different way in the poem The Hound of Heaven by Francis Thompson, 1500 years later, which begins, "I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind, and in a mist of tears I hid from him." Goes on, gets better, and at the end there is a universalistic ingathering, a redemption, where the speaker says, "Ah, fondest, blindest, weakest, I am he whom thou seekest." Universalists had an original intuition of the goodness of the Creator, or if you prefer, of creation. They say God or creation loves us, and we can bathe and be uplifted in that and in being cherished. Creation has given us life, plus wine and sex and babies and sunsets and poetry and rain and rainbows. Should not our response be to give thanks, and rather frequently, to lean into the gift, to want to be embraced by it? Some religious people praise and thank God constantly. When I am asked to provide a grace before a meal, all that ever occurs to me is to speak of it is of being thankful for everything. Universalism as an independent religion is gone, and yet it lives. It pops up in sensibilities like Albert Schweitzer's watchwords, "Reverence for life." May we Unitarians leaven our intellectualism and urgency to correct social injustice with a sense of awe for creation and an abiding gratitude for this life we have been given. May we relax and let the humble, gentle Universalists show us paths of righteousness and simplicity. May we be thusly infused with a full measure of the very best of Christian charity, the kind Jesus taught, concern for our soul and concern for the souls of others and for their condition, beginning with family and moving outward to concern for the souls around here and in our other communities, and finally to everyone, to the billions that we don't know, yet we care for. Universal care. We want everyone to be saved, no one forgotten, no one left out, no one burning in hell in this life or another. In the 1990s, as the drive for what would later be known as marriage equality, the New Yorker magazine ran a cartoon showing a middle-aged couple at home reading, and the woman looks up for her magazine and says, "Gay people want the right to get married." And the man says, "Haven't those people suffered enough?" Let's ask ourselves, hasn't everyone suffered enough? Some may benefit from being humbled, but who needs to suffer more than ordinary life provides? Our duty is to ease suffering. As a Universalist wrote, "The mission of the Universalist Church has been a double one. First, to controvert the one-time prevalent idea of an endless torment in hell. This part of the mission has practically been accomplished. The second and more important one awaits fulfillment, a fight which shall continue until the real, actual hells, embraced by so many before our eyes, are destroyed."